Back again. Okay, this one is true lecturette style. This is what I was really shooting for in the redesign of this course. It is shorter, kind of to the point lectures. I'm gonna say hey to Rosie. Hi, Rosie. Hello, Rosie. So, we're going to talk social cognition. I had a social cognition course at Irvine, University of California, Irvine. Hey, what's the mascot at Irvine? You think about that, right? Everyone knows the mascot of Ohio State, right, or UCLA, but University of California at Irvine. What do you think? Anyway. So I had this class at Irvine with Dr. Ditto. He was actually my undergraduate advisor as well, and it was social cognition. And we talked a little earlier about social cognition versus social psychology, and I think social cognition is more in your head and more process oriented, but it's hard to draw a demarcation that we could argue for precisely. And there's a lot of overlap and a lot of blending. So I got a couple principles in social cognition. Again, please be reading your text, and it's probably better to read your text before you view the lecturettes, right? Because I'm not doing this old school style. I've made a conscious decision. Dr. Cravens Brown, I don't know if you've had her for any classes, it's like, we're doing the big rock theory. My lecturettes are devoted to a couple big points that I want you to take away. The text is giving you the breadth, so it's a combination of the two. And again, remember that quizzes are based largely, and weekly quiz based largely on the text, so you need to read that thoroughly. Assignments are more tied to the lecturettes, right? So that's the strategy here, and it's the first time that I've kind of fully employed the strategy. So I'll be interested in your feedback and in how this has worked, because it is a departure for me. I'm old school. When I first started teaching, I came in and lectured. There was no activities, none of that bullshit. I came in and lectured. There was 2 or 3 midterms during the quarter, because I learned on the quarter system, and a final exam. That was it, right? Except for this class, the writing class, there was 6 papers, as I told you earlier. Let's talk about social cognition and what I think are some key, let's be cliche, some key takeaways from social cognition that are appropriate to the assignments that I'm pushing at you. So what is social cognition? It's a study of how people perceive, interpret, process, remember information, but especially in social situations. So remember in the introduction, I showed the picture of that baby looking at that screen and those colors. That's to look at the mental processes. But now we're talking about mental processes that are tied to social situations. So it's broader than just cognitive science when we talk social cognition. Now, perception versus social perception. Cognitive psychologists would study perception, and one of my favorite instructors when I was at Irvine was Dr. Charlie Chubb, and he studied the eye and how the eye interfaces with the brain and the visual perceptual process. It's a very narrow field to study. The 2 classes I took with him was human intelligence and human memory. Oh, just excellent classes, right, that really allowed him to branch out. But perception, right, what we're talking about is recognition and processing of a stimuli, and it's a straight-up process, basically, and it's how the eye operates. So it's probably what you're familiar with from maybe Psych 1100 when you did that chapter on sensation and perception. Now, social perception extends the idea based on the knowledge that when we perceive, for example, a person, we're aware that the other person is perceiving us. So in perceiving them, we're attempting to perceive, as we perceive them, how they're perceiving us, and our perception of their perception then may guide or modify our behavioral choices as a result of that interface. So perceiving this scratch pull is pretty straightforward because there it is, right? But perceiving another person, if you are here in the class, if we're in a classroom environment, I was looking at you, I'm perceiving you, perceiving me, perceiving you, perceiving, and we can go on ad infinitum. But it makes it a more important kind of quality. So the 2 big points that I kind of wanted to make here are, and first point is when we're in a social situation, and we're trying to figure the world out. We're trying to think our way through this interaction with a person. When we're trying to make a decision and come to a conclusion for that decision, big question is, how do we decide when we've thought enough about it? And who makes the decision that you've thought enough? Well, Mark, you've considered your two options. You've looked at the Firebird. You've looked at the Camaro. How much more information do you need before you make the decision to buy one or the other? Right? Who ultimately decides when we've thought enough, when we've communicated enough in a social setting, when we've tried to get into the head of the other person? Who makes that decision, right? Who decides when enough is enough? And of course, then the executive, of course. And this refers to executive function. It might also be akin to what philosophers talked about was the homunculus, the little guy in your head. We're going to revisit this notion when we get into the lecturette on the self, when we talk about William James. And that is, who knows about me? I know about me. And notice, there is the rub. I know about me. So me is an object which can be known. But who knows about me? It's I. And I is the executive, the homunculus, however you want to get to it. More on that in a little bit. So the executive then operates on three motives, according to David Dunning, in the thinking process. Right? And the executive then has these three guiding principles. The executive, that is the I running the me, right, has a desire for knowledge. I need to know shit, because if I don't know shit, what happens? Then I croak. I die. If I don't know anything, if I don't know what to eat, if I don't know when to eat, I don't know to not step in front of buses that are hurtling down the street, I'm going to croak. So survival, right, requires that we have information. So part of our human condition, for better or for worse, is we desire knowledge. Now, you might argue that some people that don't seem to desire knowledge and barely function through life, and you're surprised they're still alive. Okay. Individual differences, right? Bell curve, right? But ultimately, we have a desire for knowledge. But knowing something isn't all that good if what we know isn't right. So we desire affirmation, and affirmation is a fancy word for saying that it's correct, that it's affirmed by the evidence. So I need to know stuff, but I need to know that what I know is correct. And if you ever question yourself, that's an interesting piece of information, but I'm not sure it's correct. And if it's not correct, then believing in it might be dangerous to me. So, if you're contemplating smoking a cigarette and someone says, you could say, I wonder what cigarettes do. And then I wonder if that, and someone tells you, I've been smoking cigarettes all my life and it hasn't hurt me. Well, that's information, but is it correct? And it's like, do you want to base your future on someone else's analysis of what smoking does or doesn't do, or the risks it poses or doesn't pose? And think about this in our current COVID situation and mask wearing. Well, I don't wear a mask. I'm not going to wear a mask. And it's like, but does a mask help protect you? And it's like, so is this good information or is it bad information? Right? And how do we know? And that's part of what this class is about also, is kind of helping us to develop our critical thinking skills. How can I answer that question? Right? Is a mask beneficial or not? Where might I go for information to see that my information is correct? And then finally, and one of the big challenges, and when we talk about Festinger and cognitive dissonance at a future assignment and a future lecturette, the desire for coherence. Does what I know about this and does what I know about this, do they support each other or do they contradict each other? Because this is the bitch, man. When you know something and you learn something new that contradicts what you already know, now it puts us into a state of anxiety, because it's like, what if this is incorrect? Or what if what I believed prior to this is incorrect, right? And if two pieces of information are not coherent, right, they contradict each other, then one of them is probably freaking wrong, which violates the desire for affirmation, which then violates really my desire for knowledge, because I don't know shit. So, three pieces to the puzzle here in social cognition, according to David Dunning, and there's David Dunning, right? Okay. We have a desire for knowledge. We have a desire to know that that knowledge is correct. And as we accumulate more knowledge, it should be consistent with what we already know. So there's David Dunning for us. Let me ask you this. Dunning's name has been in the news. If you follow politics at all, Dunning's name has been in the news an awful lot. Have you heard the Dunning-Kruger effect? Dunning and his collaborator Kruger developed this theoretical proposition that, how do I put this? That some people don't know what they know is wrong. That at a certain level of intelligence, right, as intelligence starts to diminish, people don't have the capacity to know what they know is wrong. That is, they don't have the ability to affirm their own knowledge. So they'll argue vociferously for their point because they don't have the intelligence to understand what they need to know and how to test their propositions. So I think that was put in the kindest way I can. Anyway, so that's from David Dunning. Now let's talk briefly about motivation. And remember, I talked earlier about the struggle of establishing motivation in social psychology. And this is Ziva Kunda, and in her 1991 paper, Motivated Reasoning, she challenged psychologists, social psychologists. She said, look, there's literally, tens of thousands of studies that have been conducted in social psychology. And some of them do, in fact, demonstrate evidence of motivation. But the problem was the hypothesis as it was stated in the experiment didn't include motivation. The results kind of indicate motivation, but she says what we have to do is we have to go back and we have to replicate those papers, but we have to then create a new hypothesis as part of the replication and include motivation in it. That is the manipulation of motivation and the measure of motivation. And that's what Dr. Ditto did so successfully. So in 1991, Dr. Kunda, Ziva died, she was 40 or 41. It was a horrible thing. A brilliant person, brilliant researcher, brilliant theoretician. She died of brain cancer, and it was a tremendous loss to social cognition and social psychology and to the world in general because she had so much more. She had another 30, 40 years left in her career had she not succumbed to the brain cancer. It's really a tragic story. So she was talking about motivated reasoning, and I'll talk about Ziva throughout the course, right? But motivation is any desire, wish, or preference that concerns the outcome of a given reasoning task. So what Kunda is saying, when people go and seek information, that when they want to come to a conclusion, they may in fact be motivated to come to one conclusion rather than another. And when someone wants to arrive at this conclusion, then they tend to favor information that is consistent with that conclusion, and they tend to disfavor, ignore, argue against information that refutes their desired conclusion. So what she was saying is reasoning is not this cognitive process that's free from emotion or motivation, that motivation and emotion kind of drive the reasoning process to reach the conclusion that someone wants to attain. So the idea is, can we then just be open-minded and say, let me see where the data leads me, rather than I want the data to lead me to this point, right? So I'm going to go back to this example of mask wearing because it's so prevalent now. I don't want to wear a mask. So I'm going to find all the information that supports not wearing a mask. Whereas someone else says, I think wearing a mask is a good idea, and now they're going to cherry pick information that leads them to conclude that yes, mask wearing is a good idea. And notice that this dovetails really nicely with Dunning's idea of the executive, because who's calling the shots here? It's this executive function which provides the motivation for the reasoning task. So this is how two of us could look at the same information and come to very different conclusions because we were motivated to come to one conclusion or the other. And we processed the information in a way that favored or allowed us to do that. So there's two categories of motivated reasoning, as Ziva tells us. That is to arrive at an accurate conclusion. And you know, for a lot of scientists, that's where we're at. Hey, I don't care what the conclusion is, as long as I feel confident that that conclusion is based on data, that it was an accurate conclusion, right? And that's kind of the fair-minded approach. But sometimes we arrive at a particular directional conclusion. And in this case, think about it. We're going to do kind of a synthetic assignment where we're going to talk about relationships and we're going to talk about attributions. That is the cause of behavior that we observe. And it's going to look at this, that sometimes we want to, we're tired of our partner, we want to get out of a relationship, so we start focusing on the bad aspects of the relationship. In a different relationship, we might want that relationship to go on forever, and we truly love this person. So then we tend to minimize the bad in the relationship and maximize our awareness of the good in the relationship. And notice, this is really motivated. It's the same relationship, but depending on the end result, whether we want the relationship to to continue or to end, right, affects how we process the information in the relationship. And that's motivated reasoning, right? So the executive kind of supplies the motivation, and once the motivation has been supplied, that affects how we reason our way through the task. And sometimes we're motivated to be accurate, but other times we're motivated that we want it to come out a certain way. Yeah. Now, Ziva put a little caveat on this last one. That is, but people are not at liberty to believe just anything. And I don't know if that's true anymore. When we live in a time where things are continually branded as fake news, or I love the statement, well, alternative facts. What the hell is an alternative fact? But notice, this last idea about people aren't at liberty to believe just anything, I'm not so sure that's true anymore. I think people have found a way now to reason in that they can believe just about anything they want. And evidence be damned, the real world, never mind any of that. So, through these motivations, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about person perception coming up, right? And when you read about it in your book, just as an example, a couple motivated biases is confirmation bias. The tendency to seek to confirm our original hypothesis and belief. Right? So this is one technique that we use, is once I've purchased the Firebird and decided not to choose the Camaro, two very similar cars. They were made at the same plant in Van Nuys, California, right? My old stomping grounds where I grew up. Right, should I buy a Firebird? Should I buy a Camaro? Well, they're made in the same plant. One's a Pontiac, one's a Chevy, right? And there's some small cosmetic differences, but for the most part, very similar cars, right? Once I buy that Firebird, right, I'm going to look for information that confirms the wisdom of my purchase. I want to confirm that I was a smart consumer. Now, what's the motivation here? Well, I hinted at it now, this last line. I want to see that I'm a smart consumer. That is, I want to feel good about myself. So I'm making a decision. I'm collecting information to make myself feel good. That's a motivation, right? So the confirmation bias. And then the hindsight bias, right? Well, the tendency to believe that we would have predicted an outcome after the fact. So we learn about an outcome and we say, well, that's what I thought was going to happen in the first place. And what's my gain for doing that? And we're going to have an assignment, a couple assignments looking at gain. How do people benefit from the psychological programs, processes that they run? And in this case, right, it's a tendency to believe we would have predicted it. Look at me. Look how freaking smart I am. Boy, am I a good predictor. I understand my world. Other people didn't see it, but I sure saw it. And it's not hard to see what that motivation is. So a couple of two theories kind of morph together there, and they'll support some assignments that we got coming up here. All right, that's it for this one.